Who are they? The Lost Boys? They're the children who fall out of their perambulators when the nurse is looking the other way. Oh, what fun it must be. Yes, but we are rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship. Girls, you know, are much too clever to fall out of their prams.
Men and escapism. Where do we begin?
Why don't you just begin by reading off the statistics on porn consumption and or video game usage?
Per stats released by Pornhub in 2017, claims that 81 million visits a day, 28.5 billion per year, and more than 7,000 gigabytes of content uploaded every minute.
Mm-hmm.
Its audience is 75% male and 25% female. Among female searchers, lesbian is the number one search term.
Mm-hmm.
The average age of a Pornhub viewer is 36, though the largest share of its audience, 30%, is between 18 and 24.
And that's what they'll admit to, because the age verification on sites like that is paltry to non-existent. Estimates
for porn share of internet traffic vary by method. If total number of visitors to a site is the metric, it's as low as 4%. If searches estimates are used, it's closer to 13%. And if bandwidth is the measure, it's as high as 30%.
Mm-hmm.
As of 2018, estimates for pornography revenue in the United States varied between $6 billion and $15 billion. For context, the NBA grossed $8.76 billion and the NFL grossed $16 billion in 2019, while Netflix grosses closer to $11 billion. Exposure to pornography happens young. A study out of Middlesex University in the UK found 48% of children aged 11 to 16 had viewed pornography, and a study in Ireland by the journal Porn Studies found 52% of boys were 13 or younger at first viewing.
None of which is surprising to me.
Or me, but damn.
Mm-hmm.
30% of internet bandwidth is porn.
Yeah, to me, the revenue is what hits it home. To think that, like, because porn isn't discussed in polite society, but like NFL football dominates conversations. I can't talk to most men my age without hearing at some point, like, you know, who's your favorite team? Who's your favorite player? Like, do you play fantasy sports? But in terms of revenue, it's comparable at the high end of the estimates to NFL revenue.
Well, and I'm also sure like men have their favorite porn site and or performer.
Yep, sure, certainly.
But why is the variable so large? Like six billion and 15 billion. It's kind of huge.
That's a great question. Because it's hard to measure, especially with the rise of cam sites. There's like freelance pornography performers who are basically like individual people, often college students, like selling themselves, their bodies, pictures of themselves, videos online. And it's harder to like get an estimate of that revenue.
Why?
Well, because they're not companies. They're paying individual taxes rather than like registered as corporations and paying taxes that way.
So we don't know what the actual.
That's why the estimates vary so widely.
Yeah,
like there are like porn production companies that are like Hollywood studios, basically, where they have big budgets and they'll shoot like narrative films. And then there's like, you know, a college girl in her dorm with a webcam, and she could make a lot of money. OnlyFans publishes this. OnlyFans is a website that's like a subscription. It's like, I described it as Facebook, but X-rated, and you subscribe by paying, I think it's a monthly fee, but it might also be like a per picture, per video basis. The incentive for women to produce the content, and it's young women, is that they get a subscription payment based on the number of like followers they have. They can make a lot of money. And one of the things that's really insidious about this site is that it'll tell these women, you're in the top 5% of earners. You're in the top 10%. Like it'll literally it'll quantify to them where they are in terms of like how many subscribers they have, in the same way that Instagram will tell you how many followers you have. So it's tapping into something competitive in human nature in the same way that video games do with men.
And Instagram,
yeah.
So is OnlyFans really... First of all, isn't there an interesting little background? Like who was OnlyFans founded by?
Oh, I only read this recently, but it's like a former investment banker and his son, I believe.
But of course.
Yes.
And then...
but it's not the only site that does something like this. But those became like, those didn't exist, I think, like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, at least for sure. Like porn used to be, there used to be a higher barrier to entry in the sense that like a woman had to commit to being a porn star. Whereas now you can remain relatively anonymous and do it from your dorm room.
Sign up to make money and interact with your fans.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very simple tagline. Oh, and it's all women.
But this is why it's hard to measure porn revenue. And it's also, by the way, it's driving down the value of sex work, which is like that's become a kind of battleground among sex workers, is like, well, if I do this professionally and you're doing it as an amateur, but you're making comparable money, like there's only so many people who are going to pay for pornography. I think there are more now than there were 10 years ago, and certainly more 10 years ago than there were 30 years ago.
Well, Pornhub also did the work of making most porn on the internet free, for better or for worse. Right.
Yeah. And that's part of why it's so accessible. Like,
so wait, but if you have, this is interesting to explore a little bit, getting back to OnlyFans. So basically, and there are, I'm assuming, male content contributors as well on OnlyFans.
I assume so.
But let's say it's majority female.
It almost certainly is majority. All of pornography is. But
it's not a pornography site, right? Per se. It's not explicitly saying that.
It's X-rated.
Whatever, yeah.
It's not a, you know, like Twitch has like its element of like attracting lonely men with beautiful women who wear skimpy clothing. But there's no nudity on Twitch. And OnlyFans is like
nudity.
And up to like,
and it's locked content, so you have to subscribe to access the nudity.
I believe so, yeah.
So,
and I believe it's a subscription model too, which is it's a way of incentivizing the women, because you can make a ton of money doing this. My God, like if you have enough followers, it's like Patreon.
And you don't have to be a porn star. So, but what's interesting is, let's say, because I'm curious, so Pornhub is free. You can access porn for free on Pornhub.
There's also a premium one, which they made available worldwide for free during COVID.
Interesting.
They're always doing things like that, which is kind of interesting. They're always promoting themselves in strange ways. Like they plant a certain number of trees per million views or something. Like,
we're do-gooders at our core.
It's been very normalized, is all I'm trying to say. Like,
right.
It's
you feel good about putting your money there. No, but okay. So Pornhub, interesting, was founded in 2007 in Montreal, no less.
Mm-hmm.
No surprises there either. But if Pornhub exists and it's free, why would men pay for something like OnlyFans? What's the incentive there?
Well, men also pay for pornography. Like
that never changed, is what you're saying.
Well, what changed is there's a lot of free pornography, which I think made it more widely accessible.
That was a major turning point in online porn too, when it became free.
Right.
Much to the degradation of the industry itself and all the other issues around it. John Ronson does a really amazing 7-part podcast on that called The Butterfly Effect.
Right.
Where he like reveals how free porn changed internet trafficking and what the repercussions of that basically on the industry.
Oh, I don't even think we haven't even begun to grapple with the consequences of that on society. Like really.
Like free porn.
Free, widely available, high definition video pornography. And available to teenagers and prepubescent boys.
Well, so one of his episodes, one of John Ronson's episode in The Butterfly Effect is exploring, most of it is exploring the direct kind of impact of free porn on the industry and on users. But then he has an episode that sort of flaps out into larger society and basically hones in on the fact that young people are actually being educated about sex via porn. Mm-hmm. And as a result, there's obviously like a rise.
How else would they be educated?
Right. But interestingly, there's a rise in porn addiction, and then young people are having much less sex as a consequence. And also, apparently, erectile dysfunction is way up among young men.
The National Health Centre in Britain actually directly attributed a rise in ED diagnoses in young men to pornography consumption, very famously. But that's there's a funny, we could discuss porn, just talking about pornography for hours. And then part of what would happen in that discussion is, like when I was looking up the statistics on porn consumption, you find like two opposing camps, one of which is broadly pro pornography and like pro, like the sex positive camp. And it's like, it's, helping you explore your kinks and finding out who you are and what you like. And it's empowering. And then there's like a heavily religious, socially conservative camp that like views pornography is like inherently evil and the devil's work. And because they have their innate biases, they're going to play up certain studies, play down other studies. And that's a fascinating conversation, but I'm much more interested in porn as escapism for men. Because if you're talking about all pornography viewers, probably most visitors to Pornhub are casual visitors. They go like 2 to 3 times a week, maybe. But there's a subset of men, very lonely men, who pay for pornography, who go daily to sites like Pornhub or OnlyFans, who interact with and a big allure of pornography is they get to interact with the women and get the women to talk to them and feel like they're being heard and spoken to. And I have no idea. I don't know how we could quantify what percentage of men that is. I'm sure it's low, but I'm sure it's also high enough to be shocking. And I think that's a very interesting avenue to discuss. It goes undiscussed normally.
Okay, so, well, I mean, in the hopefully by now we understand the reasons for which men are seeking escapism and finding outlets to not participate or not really have to deal with their daily realities.
Well, just to summarize those, because the one that if we put off marriage and if dating is a game that only a handful of men can play to their advantage and most men kind of find it humiliating or dissatisfying, then pornography kind of wins. It gains, it benefits from this. Sex workers benefit from this. It helps if you're in the sex industry. It helps if you have a larger pool of lonely single men. All of a sudden your market goes up dramatically. And one of the things that I've for years I've noticed this. I've read they're called AMAs, Ask Me Anythings on Reddit, which is one of the world's largest forum websites. And prostitutes and former strippers and former sex workers will often post like, "Hey, I did this for 5 years. Like, ask me about it." And they'll get a range of questions from questions about STDs to how much money they made. But one of the questions that comes up is like, what were the unusual requests? And almost, or what surprised you about doing sex work? And one of the things that all of them say, like it's just a consistent answer, is, I'm shocked at how lonely men are and how much of it isn't even sexual for them. It's just wanting to feel heard and wanting human contact.
So to give more weight to that, one of the episodes in The Butterfly Effect, basically like there's a request that comes in. I think it is for Pornhub. You can actually submit requests. Men can actually say like, I'd like a woman to perform this, and they pay a certain amount of money for women to perform certain tasks. And some of them are really bizarre and some of them are fetish oriented. And a lot of them are actually painfully human, basically requesting the performer to behave like a girlfriend might. And
sorry, that's actually a category of, they call it girlfriend experience. That's literally the category. They sell the girlfriend experience. There you go.
But like, it's not like a sugar baby where you actually can meet this person in person. You're literally paying just to see them on a video.
Or to have them text you.
I didn't know that.
Oh yes, that's part of the girlfriend experience.
Oh, that's so painful.
That is very painful. Imagine having to pay for the girlfriend experience. That's something you have to pay for.
Well, so anyway, in one of the episodes, a man basically requests one of the women to sit in jeans and a t-shirt and dissuade him from committing suicide in her own words. And she's struggling basically to get through the words of encouragement, and she's doing it ad lib. And fighting back tears. And it's like
pressure.
Yeah. I mean, and it's also, it's all the more powerful when you're hearing it on audio and you don't even have to see the video. You can just imagine what that looks like. But we don't know if that viewer who requested that did or did not commit suicide. But yeah, I think what we're driving at, and this is something, I'd love to find, this is something that Wesley Yang touched on really beautifully in one of his essays in his recent book, The Souls of Yellow Folk. But the monetization of male loneliness, I think, is really what.
One of the standout essays in that book is on, I can't remember the man's name, but before the Pulse nightclub shooting, he had killed the most people in a single shooting in American history. He did it at Virginia Tech, I think. It was his university. And he describes, prior to him doing this, he'd actually had the campus police called on him because he was flirting with a girl, and he thought he was flirting with her, and she thought he was harassing her, making her feel very uncomfortable. And so she called and one of the standout lines is, and it's very uncomfortable because it's Yang identifying with this guy who goes on to commit mass murder, but he says something like, imagine having the type of face that, your romantic overtures occasion having the police called.
Which is obviously, yeah.
He was probably socially inept too. There's probably a lot of things
off when he was
sure
with her. It wasn't necessarily his face that put her off.
No, of course.
But it was a beautiful essay nonetheless in terms of being able to relate to the desperation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Wesley Yang, in one of his essays, I think one of the earlier essays, I remember highlighting this line and I've gone back to reread it a few times, but he basically encapsulates modern dating in a few lines, and it relates specifically to male loneliness. And here it is. You wake up to find yourself one of the disadvantaged of the fully liberated sexual marketplace. If you are a woman, maybe you notice that men have a habit of using and discarding you, pleading their own inconstancy and premature emotional debauchery as a sop to your wounded feelings. If you are a man, maybe you notice that the women who have been used and discarded by other, more highly valued men are happy to restore, for a while, their own broken self-esteem by stepping on you while you are prone, and reminding you that even a society of outcasts has its hierarchies. Indeed, those hierarchies are policed all the more ruthlessly the closer to the bottom you go.
Mm. That's not even the quote I had in mind, actually.
What was the quote you had in mind?
He's referring to those disadvantaged people in the marketplace, and he says, "For these people, we have nothing but options. Therapy, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, alcoholism, drug addiction, pornography, training in mixed martial arts, mail-order brides from former Soviet republics, sex tours in Southeast Asia, prostitution, video game consoles, protein shakes and weightlifting regimens, New Age medicine, obsession with pets or home furnishings, the recovery movement, all of which are modes of survival as opposed to forms of life. Each of these options compensates for a thing, love, that no person can flourish without, and each, in a different way, offers an endlessly deferred resolution to a conundrum that is effectively irresolvable. You could even say that our culture feeds off the plight of the poor in spirit in order to create new dependencies. You might even dare to say that an undernourished human soul, desperate and flailing, prone to seeking voluntary slavery in the midst of freedom and prosperity, is so conducive to the creation of new markets that it is itself the indispensable product of our culture and our time, at once its precondition and its goal."
At once its precondition and its goal. Yeah, yikes.
Well, all of these proliferating sex work sites are perfect examples of that, because they're only made possible by large numbers of very lonely single people, mostly men. Imagine imaginatively enter into someone who subscribes to a woman on a monthly basis to see pictures or videos of her, or get text messages from her, or buy a girlfriend experience. That's loneliness that I have a hard time fathoming that.
But the exchange is terribly unequal to me, and yet
timeless, as I was going to say.
Timeless, yeah. Since time immemorial, this is
sexual and romantic intimacy for money.
Abating loneliness. And I think there's been a few articles that suggest this, but a lot of college-age girls currently in college and getting an education are paying for, their improved lifestyles through things like OnlyFans and becoming sugar babies.
Yeah, the sugar baby thing is huge now too.
And either that speaks to the ultimate sexual liberation of women, but
it's funny what that looks like.
It's so funny what
it looks like. Older men purchasing it. I don't know. I don't know who wins in that transaction, honestly.
The optics aren't great,
but it's so old fashioned in a way too.
But it's also so curious to me because it's it's like it renders dating even more dysfunctional if you have a 21-year-old and her primary experience with men is via an online website and a monetary exchange in which she pretends to be something they want her to be, performs it, or maybe that is part of her personality, and she gets money for it. Like, how then do you go out in the real world and find a real, partner?
Mm-hmm.
There has to be some kind of psychological cross, like.
Or if wealthy single men in their 40s can buy commitment-free sex very easily.
Why would they commit to a woman and a family?
That might have some consequences on family formation.
But even on just the level of it only renders just what is dysfunctional even more so, even more dysfunctional.
But let's go back to escapism, because we can riff on the dating aspect all day long. But the porn thing, it's like the trials and tribulations of modern dating. These men have either given up on or have never bothered dipping their toes into. So they have this overwhelming biological urge, which men experience as an overwhelming biological urge, especially like in their 20s.
That they need to satiate.
Yeah.
And they can't do that in person with a woman.
Right. So there's escapism there. And it becomes a kind of black hole of loneliness for them.
Well, and it's crippling.
It's crippling. There's a shame angle too, of course, because not only like sex with a romantic partner is like, it's a connection with the human being, so it's edifying, but masturbation and porn consumption is just solipsistic and lonely. And I think taken to an extreme, which I'm sure I know a lot of men are doing in the modern world, is disfiguring to their souls. And I don't mean that in a religious sense. I mean, really, like, their psyches are scarred by this time they spend shamefully masturbating.
And their ability to sexually perform if the time should come.
Or ever actually connect with another human being.
Or ever connect with a human being. And the younger you start, imagine how much damage that wreaks.
And there are all kinds of proliferating websites and forums now, which is another thing that's just like, you can't believe that this is this is an aspect of the modern world, that are like oriented towards getting men to quit using pornography or to quit masturbating, or both. And some of them have a religious kind of flavoring to them, but often they're, like the one on Reddit, the most famous one, it's called NoFap, which is just a like internet jargon for masturbation, no masturbation. And it has like 600 something thousand subscribers. Like, it's like very, very active. And it's entirely secular, or like mostly secular. It's not run by, Christian religious people who have a theological reason for not liking masturbation. It's really a kind of self-improvement thing. But the men like report their own experiences, and they report it as being very addicting. Like, they have trouble stopping. And then they also report it as being something that hinders their progress in life. It's like, I didn't go out on Friday night. I didn't go on a date. I like masturbated. I watched porn. That's a lot of men.
And okay, so would you say for the most part, the majority of people are very unaware of this phenomenon happening behind closed doors?
I imagine. I mean, like, that's part of what's tricky about this, is that pornography consumption is so widespread that
we have all those stats. We read them at the beginning. They
right.
exist.
And I'm sure the average porn I believe that. I don't have an axe to grind against porn or masturbation. I'm sure the average person does it a kind of quote unquote healthy amount, and it doesn't like distract them from life. They're not skipping out on seeing friends or doing it during work hours. But there are a subset of people, and I think they're the same people who feel so alienated from modern dating, who have kind of fallen into this hole and don't have much support or sympathy from the wider culture. They feel alienated from it. And you'll find them on places like NoFap, and it's become a very debilitating thing for them, let's say, an addiction.
So it's more...
Well,
I think, yeah. I mean, like, parents, I'm thinking of people who would this should be concerning to, like, young women, young single women, maybe even young women in relationships with someone, but also like parents, certainly, of young men. Like, I don't think they're aware to the degree to which maybe their sons or boyfriends or friends might be addicted to porn.
But we can also say, like, the stats we have on the male unemployment rate, particularly for men who haven't graduated from college. And now we have, fewer men as a percentage of all men attending college. And then also the percentage of men living at home. I think it was as high as 35% between 18 and 29, if I'm not mistaken. So if 35% of men between 18 and 29 are living at home, their love lives probably aren't great. If you live with your parents, that's going to put that's going to put a strain on your love life. It's not an easy thing to date when you live with mom and dad. So this is like partially an economic reality. Partially it's a social change that's gone unspoken of. Partially it's like this sea change in who's attending college. But all of this is having really profound ripple effects on men, on women, on dating, on society. And it's a wonderful example. In economics, there's like there's a strain of economic thinking that goes like, even if you do something destructive, like break a window, you're contributing to the GDP, because like now the store owner has to like pay someone to repair his window, and that's creating business. It's like increasing, the GDP of the country or the city or whatever. Like all of this is actually like, there's money to be made here.
There's
Like I don't know how
there's
easily
incentive to keep this going.
Right. Like the wedding industry is dying because there aren't as many weddings happening.
Porn in one form or another is hundreds of years old. And obviously like the progression from Playboy magazines in the 1970s, like sneaking into
it's really shocking, that progression.
Well, the internet contributed to it massively, obviously overnight.
But I don't just mean inaccessibility. I mean, there's a very big difference between like what Playboy was for like you sent me a documentary, a really great short documentary, like finding my dad's porn magazines or something like
my dad's porno tapes.
My dad's porno tapes. Like they're like, or then there's like a trope, and it's like in sitcoms from the 90s of like, you find your dad's Playboys. He's got a stack of Playboys in the garage somewhere. That's very different than like HD quality streamed pornography. Like it really is.
In terms of what? Innocence? In terms of
what you're seeing, what's being performed, how realistic it is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, obviously a Playboy magazine, it's not
innocent by the standards of.
It's not a moving image.
No, but it's not even about moving or not moving. It's like,
well, to a certain extent,
it's nudity versus like hardcore sex.
That's what I mean, but moving image. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, all of these things are feeding into each other. The second you have an industry that's between $6 and $15 billion US in revenue, I mean, the producers of this are obviously doing all they can to keep it going. Men have a biological urge and need that needs to be satisfied.
But I'm also, I was trying to suggest explicitly that there's a tension between what is good for the economy, potentially, and what is good for society. Like it's actually not a good thing if porn can make $15 billion in a year for America. It's actually like it feeds itself directly on loneliness and low marriage rates and low birth rates and dissatisfaction, sexual and romantic dissatisfaction among men and women. And
keeps young men stagnated, which, as we are attempting to reveal, is a bad thing for everybody. But what I'm curious about is like, how would you slow that down? How would you?
Well, I still think it's a product of dysfunctional dating.
Ultimately.
Yeah, massively. Because I mean, my God, you don't have to go too far back in time before people were married at 25. Like it was unusual to be single in 30. Like a lot has changed dating wise. And just the rates too. I mean,
do you think if we polled 100 men on their porn consumption and whether or not they find it satisfying, or whether or not they would prefer to date someone real,
concerning, let's say,
or concerning? Yeah. Do you think that they would feel it was concerning?
Out of 100 men, I bet like 5 to 10 at least would say it's concerning.
Which is not. I mean, that's a minority.
That's a massive minority. It's a massive minority. I mean, because
10 out of 100 men would maybe agree with you that it's concerning.
That's an estimate. That's purely an estimate on my part.
Right. Okay. So amplify that into the population.
But that's my point. Is that's a massive number of men.
Okay. Fair. But then my other question is.
Well, it's only 35% of men 18 to 29 who are living at home.
Do you think men would?
I think if you ask them, is your porn consumption like hindering other aspects of your life? That's the good question to get at whether or not it's an addiction. And I'm guessing something like 5 to 10% would say yes. of young men.
And of the men who are consuming too much porn, I'm presuming that some of them at least are in a relationship.
I'm sure that's probably true. But I think overwhelmingly it's the case that these are
single men we're talking about.
These are men who are failing pretty hard in the dating world. Yeah.
And here's another, I guess, trickier question. But do you think men currently would find dating a girl more satisfying than being able to watch porn?
I assume so.
Well, like from the female perspective, I mean, how many times like have I heard a girlfriend be upset because she finds out her boyfriend occasionally watches porn? I myself have, that's something that bothered me in past relationships.
Well, it's also
because it makes you feel insecure as a girlfriend, and it's kind of an impossible sexual standard to hold yourself up to.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I can completely comprehend that at that point, like if we're really tying this into escapism, it's kind of like a fantasy. It's kind of and love for fantasy.
But I'm not even suggesting. I don't think most men use porn as escapism. Like that's what I was saying earlier, but the average Pornhub viewer probably doesn't think about it, probably does it 2 to 3 times a week. I think the Pornhub's own statistics said it was like 10 to 12 minutes per visit. That's very different from someone who's paying a performer to like say their name on a video or to send them text messages.
Yeah, there's a line. There's
not a lot of overlap, I don't think.
No, but the act itself, I'm just saying, is a form of escapism. It's a fantasy that you might not necessarily be able to act out in real life.
Yeah, but so is reading 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah.
Which is like the best-selling book in history now. And that was almost exclusively women. I don't know any men who've read that book or that series of books.
Mm-hmm. So it feeds into that.
Well, like human beings are sexual and have sexual fantasies.
Right.
I don't know that we're ever going to.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like, I think what I'm getting at is like, I don't think it's possible to eradicate porn.
But I'm not, again, like that's why I didn't want to stake out a position that was like analogous to what the Christian right want. I'm not saying they're wrong even. I'm just saying that's not the axe I want to grind. I'm only pointing out that for a substantial minority of men, it's problematic. It's a way that they're avoiding looking at real problems in their life that are only going to get worse the longer they don't look at them. And that's part of, there's Andrew Yang, who eventually went on to become a Democratic presidential hopeful, wrote an essay about video games and men that kind of came to the same conclusion, which is they're fun. And for most people, it's probably just a fun hobby. But for a subset of men, video games are a way of avoiding responsibility, of not looking at your personal failures, of delaying growth. And if you do that for too long, for too many consecutive years, you're going to find yourself in a hole that'll be very difficult to dig yourself out of. And I love video games. I'm not trying to, like, there are people who think there's people on the right and people on the left who think video games are, a causal factor in male violence. I don't think that. But I do think that for a minority of video game users, they are problematic. They're an addiction and an escape, and they prevent them from moving forward in their lives. And I personally know people.
And those are the men we're speaking to.
Yeah.
Let's pivot to video games.
Yeah.
In his essay, Video Games and the Male Meaning of Life, Andrew Yang wrote this. Did he write it for Colette?
Yeah.
So I'm quoting him now. They speak to a primal set of basic impulses, to world creating, skill building, achievement, violence, leadership, teamwork, speed, efficiency, status, decision-making, and accomplishment. They fall into a whole suite of things that appeal to young men in particular. To me, the list would go something like this: gaming, the stock market, fantasy sports, gambling, basketball, science fiction geek movies, and cryptocurrencies, most of which involved a blend of numbers and optimization. It's a need for mastery, progress, competition, and risk. So why I love this essay, because it was one of the only ones I read on video game culture among young men that I could actually relate to, and it helped me understand the desire to play them better from a male point of view. Because those, I think, inarguably are very kind of positive things that they appeal. The reasons for which they appeal to young men are actually quite positive.
Or they could be positive. Like status is one that can go either way. If your status is like,
but mastering a skill, achieving something.
But again, is it a skill that's like useful and productive in the real world, or is it a skill that exists only in the virtual world?
But I'm just if we're keeping it in the fantasy world and if we're keeping it in escapism, I think it is interesting that they're resorting to a place in which they can actually have a role to play as a leader or as a member of a team. That also, you know, that's a little, I guess, shot of serotonin for them. It's like a boost. It's a feel-good way of engaging with a world, maybe not the real world.
Yes.
And competition.
And I think there's something pure about video game competition that men recognize and respect and seek out. And I think that's no longer the case for real world competition. I don't think the rules are as plainly visible to them or the rewards. And I think there's something about the purity of video game competition that's deeply attractive to young men. I would say I know that, actually. On this, I can speak from personal experience. A lot of personal experience.
Tell me about that. When did you start playing video games?
7.
7 years old?
7 or 8.
Okay, well, like what, N64? Like what?
No, Nintendo. At friends' houses, yeah.
When did you start getting into more specifically computer games?
Also very young, like in the 90s, when like
you were playing SimCity
dial-up internet. I played SimCity. I played Diablo 1 and 2. Played StarCraft. Played Warcraft 3.
And what appealed to you about them? At that time in your life?
Apart from the fact that they were fun and often had intriguing stories, there was that sense of you start off with nothing, and you can, if you're dedicated and you're good and you persevere, you can acquire skill and kind of competency, and there's a ranking system so that you can, you know, people know that you have skill and competency. Like you can walk around as the big shot in the game world because you've achieved those things. And I have friends. I played a strategy game, a real-time strategy game called Warcraft 3 competitively. So I had, at one point in my life, which was in university, I was playing games against Asian players, and I'd have to, you know, it'd be like 2 a.m, let's say, like absurd hours, and I'd have to be up. Or then I'd be versing, you know, people in Europe, and I'd have to be up in the morning. I had a manager that I never met who had my phone number and who would text me. This was like the very early days of esports, which are now a real thing. Like esports has become a market unto itself, but this was like before there was even very much money in it. It was purely prestige and like the right to say that you were the best. And I have friends that I made there in that game that I still speak to. And some of them have, you know, some of them are lawyers and doctors and married and have families. Some of them still live with their parents.
And you never met them in person?
And I met one of them in person.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
When was that?
He came to my university very briefly. Great guy. He's the guy who became a lawyer.
And he came to like say hi to you? I won't put
him on blast because he's worked for like pretty famous people. Yeah, he was driving through Connecticut. He was like, "Hey, can I come say hi?" And we went out for dinner and hung out and played games together. And I'd known him for like 3 years prior to that.
No way.
And I spoke to him like a week ago. And I met him like in person like almost a decade ago. But I have another friend I've known the exact same amount of time, who's literally never left. He lives with his mom and never didn't live with his mom. And he's like
your age.
He's my
early 30s.
He's my age. He's still a virgin. And he's like,
and he admits to that?
Oh yes. He's like, his part of his identity now is like, I'm a failed male. Like that's like how
Incel?
No, he's not bitter. Like but he like his like sense of humor among his friends is like very self-deprecating. It's very sad to witness, actually.
Wow.
Yeah. And these men are it's so funny. Like he's invisible. He's an invisible man. Like his life, like almost doesn't. I mean, he's like, I don't think he's ever worked more than part-time. And so he's just disappeared from the world. His mom just supports
his.
I'm sure there's some psychodrama there that I'm not fully aware of.
Another episode for another time. But
yeah.
I don't know, what I was found intriguing was it's not, I mean, by high school cliche stereotype definitions, you were also quite a jock. You loved sports. You played football. You played basketball.
Jocks love video games too. It's a very universally male thing. They play different games usually, but they still love games.
But right, I just think it's interesting to make those distinctions between like men who have outlets and men who like in the physical world of sports and men who don't, because there is a distinction there. There are nerds who don't play sports who get heavily into video games or Magic the Gathering, or any other game, fantasy type game. But yeah, so there are also jocks who get into video games.
If you go to any frat in America right now, you'll find Call of Duty like on a PlayStation or Xbox console. In the
so
main
obviously
area.
this I think this is safe to say that it actually just feeds into the male psyche. There's obviously something universally appealing about it.
It's fun. It's competitive. There's a
it has all of the benchmarks.
It's simulated violence, and that has its appeal to men for sure.
Which is another important,
And there's skill. You get to distinguish it. Even in Call of Duty, even in the shooter games, there's like a massive difference between the average player and how good they are and the very good players.
And people actually watch live streams of other people playing video games.
It's insanely popular.
That blows my mind.
Yeah, it's very, very, very popular.
They're treating it like a sporting event. Explain that to me.
It is, but it is a sporting event. It's exactly that. It's skill. And if you've played the game and can appreciate the skill that goes into it, which a third party who has never played the game might not be able to appreciate, then it's not entertaining for them. But if you appreciate how skilled people are, it's massively entertaining. Massively. And there are guys like, I don't know all of the most popular streamers. I have friends who could, but they'll regularly have like 100,000 people or more watching them play a video game. And think about that. That's like more than, that's an NFL stadium or larger, a big soccer stadium in Europe, watching one person play a video game. It's actually astonishing.
Well, and so, and in Yang's article, young men without college degrees have replaced 75% of the time they use to spend working with time on the computer, mostly playing video games. Mm-hmm. And in 2014, the average time spent per week had more than doubled from 2007. So to 8.6 hours
per week,
which feels kind of like even now, like.
Well, that's an average.
That's an average.
Oh, yeah. Oh, when I was competing, when I was playing competitively, and I was in university at the time, I was playing computer games for more hours every day than I was in school. Absolutely.
So here's another one. So a 2015 Center survey, 33% of young men 18 to 29 identify as gamers compared to 9% of young women. Mm-hmm. From a Center survey of people ages 13 to 17, 97% of teen boys play video games compared to 83% of girls, but the boys were almost 4 times as likely, so 41% versus 11%, to say they spend too much time playing video games. Mm-hmm. So there is a recognition that they're...
Even among the boys.
Even young boys.
Yeah. Well, they know their grades are suffering, and their parents give them grief because their grades are suffering. We have relations who had this experience.
Of course, but I'm also wondering, so escapism on the one hand, but also like what about like higher levels of, I guess, addictive personalities are probably greater in men than they are in women. I don't have the research or information to back that up right now, but like I also think it's really interesting that like monomania and being able to do something obsessively for hours at a time. You pointed out to me hysterically one time that the Guinness Book of World Records is filled with men doing the stupidest things for the longest time just so they can win that title.
Status.
And like, which will forever remain in obscurity unless you look up the Guinness Book of World Records. But like, it's mostly filled with men doing these ridiculous things.
Mm-hmm. Well, we care about status, even in domains that most people don't care about or even know about.
But I think it's also interesting that level of focus and concentration for hours at a time on one thing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So why
dangerous line of thought you're going down.
Right. But so why aren't more women doing that? What is the difference there? I think that's really interesting.
So that's funny that you bring this up too, because there's a kind of, depending on how you define gaming, you can get more or less female participation. If you broaden the definition of gaming to include cell phone games, for example, women's participation rates climb dramatically. Like Bejeweled is a game women love. Animal Farm, I think. These cell phone games that people play on the subway or whatever. But if you narrow the definition to like who's playing World of Warcraft or the new Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto, like who's going to wait in line to buy the game at Best Buy the day it comes out, or who's queuing up to download it, all of a sudden, like, it becomes an overwhelmingly male thing. And my God, like, from personal experience, like, you used to be able to be entirely anonymous in gaming, but now voice chat is so popular. Like, in my, decade plus of playing one game, I think I know like 5 girls who played it. Like, you meet like, exponentially more men playing these games. And I there's probably not a single reason why that's the case, but status seeking is certainly a big part of it. Monomania. But one of the only games I know that has been and I'm talking about like computer games that has been massively popular with women, is The Sims. And The Sims is like, I mean, it's like domestic bliss, right? You create a family, and then you get them a home, and then they get a better home, and you can upgrade their kitchen. But
I remember playing that for,
oh yeah, I remember you playing that.
But not for hours, funnily enough. I got bored by it within an hour.
Yeah. But the world of gaming, like their whole kind, like Twitch, I don't think you'd ever heard of Twitch before I brought it up to you, but like Twitch is a thing. It's a site where people stream games, and that's like very male. And then there's something called Discord, which is an app and a computer program where you can voice or text chat with people and create chat rooms around different games or different teams within the games. And like I dabble in these worlds, and they're, again, like it's just overwhelmingly male experience. Like it's funny how segregated the internet is in this way. But it's also like an aspect of choice.
But it's also
like men choose to invest their time in this.
But it's also an aspect of like, if you're a lonely, introverted man, dude, young guy, 15-year-old, awkward, I'm thinking of all the scenarios in which you might retreat to the internet anyway. And this has been true since the internet came into being. But like, there's also a huge community aspect to this. Yes, you meet friends there. And it's incredibly low stakes. Like, you don't have to interact with them socially in some awkward setting.
Exactly. If you're awkward, if you're, I don't know, unattractive physically, and like normally that's a hindrance to you. Like most people don't know what anyone else looks like when they're just voice chatting over Xbox Live or on Twitch or Discord.
But what about all the racism and horrible things people say to each other?
Oh, there's a lot of juvenile male behavior here too, of course.
I've heard, honestly, that some of like the most horrific things come out of like 11-year-old voices.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of trolling it's terrible, but that's anonymity plus young men is like it's a recipe for. So
like what? Toxic masculinity unleashed?
Sure. Call it that.
But there's also a lot of positive reinforcement.
Well, I think that's still a minority of people who play games, because those people are hated. But those are people who enjoy, like they get off on making other people angry, which is like there's talking about destructive male attitudes. Like I wanted to read to you, there's a wonderful book called Notes from the Underground written by Dostoevsky. And it's about a character who's kind of disappeared from society. And I read this book maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and every man I've ever met who lives in video games and doesn't live in the real world came instantly to my mind. Destroy my desires, eradicate my ideals, show me something better, and I will follow you. You may say I'm not worth bothering with. In that case, I can say exactly the same to you. We are talking seriously. And if you do not deign to give me your attention, I will not bow before you. I have my underground. And for men who feel, let's say they have no purchase on society and feel like society has no stake in them and no interest in them,
they will find their underground.
They found an underground, yeah. And video games are a great underground because it's incredibly entertaining. It's incredibly fulfilling.
And the internet in general, more broadly.
Oh my God. The holes the internet that you can fall into. Absolutely.
You know, isn't it like, I forget where I read this, but like men are the ones writing the majority of Wikipedia articles and taking the time to do that.
Yes.
Men dominate Reddit and take the time to actually like engage.
Or just like politics on YouTube. It's so overwhelmingly male. It's shocking, actually.
And the traffic on YouTube is probably overwhelmingly male.
YouTube is predominantly male. Pinterest and Instagram and I think even Twitter are majority female.
The underground.
Yeah. Facebook is majority female. But it's so funny. These communities self-generate. Like if you go to one of these games, that it's like a good example is there's a game called Red Dead Redemption 2, which came out last year. And I think that game, I think it was like 10 years in production. Like that's a game you could spend literally hundreds of hours on and never really exhaust. Like you could throw a year into it easily and you still wouldn't like finish the game.
And they're designed to do that.
Exactly. They're open world. They really do want you to be like fully invested in that. But just if you explored the community that is generated on the internet, because there's like a whole, like, these are the fun things, like there's a whole section on YouTube, like these are the fun things I did in Red Dead. I did this, I did this, I did this. Or like the Wikipedia article on Red Dead. And then there's like offshoots of that, which are like strategies or fun. Like, I mean, it becomes like one game that's created by one company with maybe like a couple hundred employees generates like exponentially more content on the internet because people just play the hell out of it.
So if pornography is monetizing male loneliness, are video games monetizing...
Male loneliness is part of it, I'm sure.
Or like Peter Pan syndrome?
Yeah.
boyishness, maleness,
I think they tap into something more noble in men. And unfortunately, like,
which Andrew Yang was attempting to get at, and he did.
Here's where I'll be treading on thin ice with like the people who would want to cancel everyone who disagrees with them. Like the contributions men make in video games, they could be making in the real world. Like all of that energy and investment and thought that goes into something that generates nothing outside of the video game, that could be, going into creating a career or to like patenting something new, or like there's an incredible amount of inventiveness and skill and intelligence. This is often said, for example, about chess. If you look up at any given year who has the highest registered IQs, disproportionately they're chess grandmasters. And it's like, okay, great, but why are you playing chess then? Like, like I love that you're great at chess. It's great that you're great at chess, but like at that level of intelligence, like what else could you be doing? Like you could be a theoretical physicist. You could be a chemist.
Which is what I think
you could be trying to cure cancer.
But their son's playing video games.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
You're wasting your brain.
Yeah. And again, I say this as someone who loves video games, and I'm not like a crusader against video games, but it just becomes at a certain point, you've invested so much time and energy into the video game that you're not investing into things that, not only would benefit society, but would benefit you.
Yeah. More importantly, you first. Yeah.
Yeah.
In order to be able to get to society.
There's a criticism within science and technology in the STEM field that things have stagnated in the last like half century. That like, if you looked at our trajectory from 1990 to 1960, you had greater expectations for what happened after. Like Eric Weinstein, who's a sort of armchair philosopher and amateur scientist, has written about this extensively. So has Ross Duhat at the New York Times. Like, it seems like we've run out of steam. And I'm not saying this is 100% of the reason why we've run out of steam, but a big reason might be we have these virtual worlds that we can kind of get lost in. And a lot of really brilliant men are getting completely lost in these virtual worlds. Because
that's a world in which they're actually able to have a valued role.
Maybe that's a big part of it, is that they can feel valued in that world and they don't feel valued in the real world. Yeah. That would be a very dangerous line of thought to pursue. But I think it's true. I'm sympathetic to that line of thought.
Why do you say dangerous?
Because people don't want to hear that.
Why do they want to hear that?
I think there's an impatience with
male behavior, maleness, men.
There's a lot of if you look up like the phrase male genius, you'll find a lot of op-ed type articles saying, why do we construe genius as male? Why are we still thinking of geniuses as male? And I mean, I mentioned earlier, like if you look at the people with the highest IQs, you'll find a lot of chess grandmasters. You'll find a lot of men. Like it's disproportionately male. Like chess in general, like that's, in theory, that's a gender neutral playing field. It's not like basketball. Like there's no physical barrier to women's entry. But the list of the greatest chess players is just overwhelmingly male. Logic, strategy, reason. Obsessiveness. And then, I mean, it's not entirely like there's probably a high overlap with like autism or social anxiety to an extreme level. Like these are men who would play video games because like they're not necessarily like one of the greatest players in the game that I play was like a classical pianist when he was 10. And he speaks like he streams. So he like plays the game and talks to people, and he can do German, Dutch, English, French. Like he can switch languages on a dime. He's really, really smart. But and he makes great money. But that's what he's done with his life, is he's a video game player and streamer. And he makes money by... He makes a lot of money. By streaming his games. People pay to watch them. People pay on a subscription basis. Sounds familiar. They pay on a subscription basis to subscribe to his channel, even though you can watch it for free, which is interesting. Like I don't pay for him to watch him play, but people do. And then people also donate money, and they donate a lot of money. Donate money because it benefits them. This shocked me too when I learned this. They donate money. Not even because of their learning, because it's entertaining. So oh my God, they donate. There are people who donate in a single tip like €1,000. So what's the difference between a video game streamer monetizing their skill and an OnlyFans girl monetizing her beauty? What's the difference? I mean, there might not be one. They're monetizing their assets. People aren't going to want to hear that. Men don't easily monetize beauty. Do you think there's There are female streamers who don't stream because they're beautiful. They stream because they're good or entertaining. Those exist too. I wouldn't, it's still majority male. But
no, what I'm interested in is they're both monetizing the same demographic of men.
I wouldn't say that. I think like Twitch is very popular among men who aren't necessarily totally lost in life. It's still like it's a big platform now. Whereas OnlyFans,
we can agree.
I doubt I know anyone who pays for an OnlyFans subscription. Maybe I do.
Who also plays video games? You don't think there's overlap?
Oh, I'm sure there is. I'm just saying, like, there's so many more people, exponentially more people, on Twitch, exponentially more. I have a Twitch subscription because I have Amazon Prime, and that gets you a free Twitch subscription. Like, it's very popular.
It's all interconnected.
Yeah. Well, Amazon, I think they purchased Twitch, and that was like Facebook buying Instagram. It was a very savvy business move.
But I'm just pointing out too that I think it's interesting that there's this monetization happening for a certain group of men who are somehow finding a way also to afford to do that.
To do what? Like
if they're not participating in the workforce and they're playing video games.
This is very few men successfully stream. Very few. And the ones that are successful they capture like 90% of all the money. It's a lot of money, but it's still it's shared among very few people.
No, but I mean those who are paying for it.
Yeah, but it's like $4 a month, and it's free if you have Amazon Prime, and a ton of people have Amazon Prime.
But it's just interesting that these two things they exist and they kind of coexist to keep, these young men in their chairs at their desks online.
Well, I think they were already in their chairs to a huge degree. The nice aspect of Twitch is like it's interactive. There's someone talking to you. Like it's comparable in a weird way to OnlyFans or to like those campsites.
It abates loneliness in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I've mentioned, like a lot of the streamers on Twitch are people who are at the very peak of their game. Like it's like watching LeBron James play basketball. Like you're watching the best of the best. A lot of them aren't at the peak. They're just really funny and really entertaining, and they can like talk to a camera in a way that makes you personally feel like connected to that person. You're laughing along with them. You're having a good time with them. That's a skill. And they make a lot of money off of it if they're good at it. And to connect this to everything we've been talking about, if this is not necessarily good for the men to be doing these things, it increases our chances of getting a quote unquote more equal world. Because these are men who are not competing to the fullest capacity. And there are people who are happy to see that. Whether or not they know they're happy to see that because it increases the likelihood that you get greater representation of women at the top of certain fields, let's say.
So we're happy with the status quo.
Oh, I don't think most people are happy with it necessarily. I'm just saying that
but some will benefit.
The intelligentsia, let's say. Like I'm shocked to see like the high school dropout rate for men, or they're falling behind. How far they've fallen behind in literacy rates compared to women in high school. Pretty shocking. I think women are now like 66% of all valedictorians in high school. They're a very clear majority of high school valedictorians. I'm only pointing out that it serves an ideology. Right,
but the pendulum is actually now going quite far the other way. We're not at 50-50.
Well, but even 50-50 is an ideology. It isn't obvious to me.
No, it isn't obvious to anyone.
No, it's obvious to a lot of people that 50-50 should be the goal.
Obvious on an ideological level,
or what they think of as a moral level,
right.
An ethical standpoint. It's so funny how difficult that is to achieve, though, because this is people's leisure time, and men and women spend their leisure time very differently.
Apparently,
shocking. I find it so amusing. And then I told you this the other day, and I can say this like if we have an audience, I can make this prediction in a way that I'll be held to it. The industry that I can say I was at the ground level of this. When I talked to my friends, a lot of them expressed regret that they didn't keep playing video games because we were really my group of friends that I met online who competed. We were at the ground level of one of my friends who was an esports guy with me. We founded a team together. That team went on to play competitively in a different game that I didn't play. And then he parlayed his role there into a good career in a video game company sponsoring esports athletes. Like he literally made that his job.
So esports athletes, that's what they call them?
Yeah. Well, that's what they are.
They're athletes.
Well, you can quibble with the term if you like, but that's like.
But they're virtual athletes.
Virtual athletes. We'll call them whatever you want, but they have a skill.
I just think it's interesting.
Well, if you call it an e-sport, I suppose they're athletes, they're competitors, whatever you want to call them. But what I cut myself off. But what I was trying to say is, I was at the ground floor of the creation of an industry that didn't exist 20 years ago. There was no esports industry 20 years ago. It's now huge. Like the biggest video game tournaments in any given year have physical venues. They don't just happen online. They like rent out a stadium and people come into the stadium to watch them play. And for example, the Dota 2 one, I believe, which was in Vancouver last year, had a higher purse than that year's Masters in golf. So like the winning team in that won more money playing this video game than the best golfers won in the most prestigious golf tournament.
And it's only going to go up from there.
Yeah, it's gonna. Oh my God, COVID is accelerating this dramatically. For sure, it's going to be more and more popular and more lucrative. But I also wanted to point out, it's going to be hideously unequal, because it was overwhelmingly men doing this for fun before they ever made any money doing it. So all of the people at the ground level were men. All of the organizers were men.
But
all
it's
of the
men
teams
who are primarily enjoying this.
Right, but the same was true of sports.
But no, but
sports worked this exact way. Before anyone ever made a dime playing sports, sports were a leisure activity.
You think there's going to be a feminist backlash, and the reaction is going to be, why aren't more women allowed?
I've already absolutely seen this.
Wow.
That's already op-ed articles. Like, why aren't there more women in these? It's lucrative, like why wouldn't you want to get women in there? But the only point I was making is, at the ground floor, when no one was paying attention and when no money was being made, it was overwhelmingly men.
But is it safe to say that women are not? There are not more women because they're not interested?
Yeah.
And that's never reason enough.
But maybe they will be interested in the same way that like women's sports, they're not huge, but like women's tennis has become huge.
So what happens if men and women both are constantly online playing video games?
I don't know.
It's a good question.
I haven't seen women in equal levels playing video games compared to men.
No, but I think it's interesting that like that's something that like
it's more now than it was when I was a teenager, for sure.
But to even react to that, basically what you're saying is, why aren't there more women also like spending majority of their time? Sure,
but I was only pointing out that this is how inequalities perpetuate themselves. It's not because there's a cabal of men at the top who are, cigar smoking and trying to keep women out. It's because at the bottom, when it started, it was a male interest. Like everyone who and I regret in a way that I didn't pursue it. I mean, I don't, but I could have. The people who got into ground floor, as always, had an advantage early on. They got to they got first bid on like teams and setting up the infrastructure and getting sponsorships. All of that was men. And I mean, I know a lot of those guys. Like, it's so funny when I see names of like tournament organizers in games I've never played. I'm like, I remember you. I remember you. Yeah.
You stopped playing video games for a minute, though. I remember.
Well, when I was in high school, I played Diablo 2, which is that's a game that like many people still play. Like that's a game you can sink your life into. And I did. That's one of the reasons I had to stop, is because it was so time consuming.
But at what point did you recognize you were sinking your life into it?
I would get up in the mornings before school and I would set up a bot to play for me while I was at school. And I'd leave my computer on and then I'd come home and the bot had done stuff for me in the game. Like, that's how addicting it was. Yeah.
Can you describe what was addictive about it?
It was immersive. It was fun, and it was infinitely scalable. Like, there was always something more you could do. And it's so like, there are people like what social media companies hire, or what makers of smartphones and apps do. They hire people who are kind of plugged into, who have a background in human psychology, because they want you to be addicted to they want like the ping when you get a notification to sound the right way, because then you'll have a Pavlovian response to it. It's the exact and that's how these video games become so damn popular, is because they tap into these innate, very primal goals or drives that men have. Like it's so. I mentioned Red Dead Redemption 2. It's like a simulation of being a pioneer out west in the 1800s. Which is like, a lot of men I know love that idea. They love the idea of like having to hunt and fish for their food. Well, you can do that in the video game. Like, they love the idea of sleeping under the stars. You can do that in the video game. They love the idea of being a bounty hunter and chasing down an outlaw. You can do that in the video game. And it's hyper realistic now. The graphics have gone to the point where, my God, like it's immersive.
Well, speaking on that and the degree to which it's becoming more and more immersive, almost like virtual reality, is it worth speaking a little bit on the backlash from some women, some younger women too, even like YouTubers, suggesting that it gives way to, like, sort of perpetuates the worst behaviors in men and gives rise to acting on toxic masculinity in real life, like school shootings, for example, or violent acts from men. What would you have to say about that?
I mentioned, I think earlier, in the 90s when I was growing up, games like Grand Theft Auto and Doom were attacked by the Christian right. They were called murder simulators. And there was a correlation drawn between the Columbine shooters, let's say, and the games they were playing or the music they were listening to. And that was in the 90s mostly laughed off by the games industry. It was just not taken seriously. And I don't think it deserved to be taken seriously, because I think that link is tenuous at best. And then fast forward to the 2010s, and now it's the progressive left that's making this criticism. Like Grand Theft Auto, you can hire prostitutes, and then after you pay the prostitute and have sex with her, you can then beat her up and take the money from her. You can beat anyone up and take their money from them, but if you wanted to beat up a prostitute and take the money, so this was like, oh, this is rape culture. This is, teaching men to disregard women. Yeah, I've the.
Well, so what's interesting to me though, like using that example of being able to have sex with a prostitute and then beat her up and get your money back afterward.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that desensitizes men to how they might treat women?
That's exactly
same way
the argument.
Porn desensitizes men to sexual intimacy.
I don't agree, or I don't know that porn does that to the degree that people think it does. But if it's the case that Grand Theft Auto, like beating up a prostitute and then taking her money, desensitizes you to women, then surely the problem would be 1,000 times greater in terms of men's attitudes towards men, because in any given video game, you kill infinitely more men than women. In the same way that if you watch a John Wick movie or any Hollywood action movie, you watch the protagonist kill about 10,000 men for every woman who dies on screen. Right,
but that's not really like the argument.
That's not their argument, but my point is, surely if it's an issue, it's much more of an issue for male on male violence. And if there's a causal link between how you can treat women in video games and how you might treat women in real life, wouldn't that same link exist between how you treat men in video games and how you treat men in real life? But the larger criticism that I wanted to make is that very little in society reaches out to these men to begin with. And a lot of the initial attraction of pornography in video games is a response to feeling like they're invisible to the world. And it's hard to say. That's why I read that quotation from Dostoevsky. Because if the message you give these men implicitly is, unless you're contributing, you're not worthy, well, their response was going to be, well, I can play video games and enjoy myself. Of course I'll do that.
So another thing I'm curious about then is, who's responsible for taking notice?
Probably first and foremost their parents.
Right, to like early on. But
yeah.
If internet traffic is now 30%.
Bandwidth, yeah.
Internet bandwidth is now at 30%. And the rise of the video game industry to be what it's like, it's bigger than the beauty industry, right?
I don't know off the top of my head. It's massive, though.
It's massive.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, that speaks to, I mean, I don't expect capitalism to take note of what's happening behind closed doors.
It's not, nor is it capitalism's job.
Nor is it capitalism's job.
Yeah. It might be the job of your culture.
But who?
Or your country. Well, that's the thing, is who is the culture now? We don't even know.
If we're saying that these are means of escapism and how that is a problem, and there are people who have been writing about why this is a problem, like it's not like this has gone completely unreported.
Well, I'm suggesting,
whose job is it to step in society to point out how this
one of
is
the reasons I
problematic?
think no one has stepped in is because it's beneficial to, I will say, a liberal ideology, or what calls itself a liberal ideology that wants 50-50 equality between men and women. You don't have to look very far, like on sites like Salon and the Huffington Post, to find articles saying men need to lean out. Lean out, men. You don't need to be so competitive. You don't need to be so invested in your career.
That's the term they're using, lean out.
I've heard that, yeah. But they've also told women to lean in. But men are leaning out. This is a de facto leaning out. Men, I don't think they're doing it for ideological reasons, but the men who play video games for 10 plus hours, 20 plus hours a week
are wittingly or not leaning out.
Are leaning out. Yeah. And that's totally fine. Like it doesn't bother anyone.
But do you think it would
amusingly.
bother politicians or policymakers to know how they're leaning out if they knew it was so negative?
Well, who's it negative for? And in what way?
I'm talking about for the minority of men who are experiencing addiction and like insane levels of loneliness. I'm talking about the Lost Boys.
Yeah, I don't know that they have much political representation.
Right, but I'm saying
care much.
No, I don't think people care much. But if they knew, if they were aware, do you think it would change?
Maybe. I think where it starts to become a problem is when those women who have been pursuing a career all of a sudden look for men to be husbands and find out that there aren't very many men on their level anymore.
Where have all the good men gone? They've gone to video game culture.
Sure.
They're watching OnlyFans instead of taking you out on a date.
Yeah. But that was an unforeseeable, let's say, consequence of opening up dating the way we have. And we did it in the name of liberation, and maybe it was liberating, but that's a consequence of liberation is that you have only yourself to blame. You can't really...
Okay, so now tell me why we should care and why these men should have political representation, why it matters.
I actually don't think politics will solve this. I think it's a cultural problem.
Okay, so who will represent them? Why does it matter?
It matters for them in the sense that they're going to live not blighted lives, but limited lives. At a certain point, they're going to realize that their lives have been more virtual than real, and that'll bother them. It matters to society because these energies and intelligences of these men should not be wasted in virtual pursuits. Like if you really want to live in a thriving society, you're actually going to want to harness those men's efforts to something real in the world. And we haven't done that. And it matters to women because once they get through playing the self-exploration, have fun dating game they play in their 20s, and I'm talking about liberal, educated women in cities, not, conservative, rural women who tend to marry younger. Those women want husbands, and they want husbands who have specific qualities that men no longer have in cities, or very few men have in cities. And so those women are kind of destined for a little bit of a shock, I suppose, when they realize that the dating game hasn't served them well either.
Do you really think that these men who are spending a considerable, if not half their lives now, and immersed in the virtual world, do you think they will realize one day?
Oh, I think a lot of them are having enough fun that it's okay.
So they may never.
I don't imagine. I don't know. I honestly don't know. But in the same way that, I mentioned this successful streamer I spoke of earlier who was a classical pianist when he was younger and speaks 5 languages and, hyper intelligent. He was actually interviewed. He's Danish. He was interviewed in Danish television, and the guy was kind of condescending towards what he was doing with his life. And he said, well, his response was, well, if I was a chess player and I told you I practiced chess 10 hours a day, would you condescend to me like that? Would you think that was a waste of my time? And if not, why?
To which the interviewer replied,
was stumped. because we don't think of chess players as wasting their time. I mean, it might really be a huge waste of that massive intelligence that they're playing a game, because theoretically they could do almost anything else, and almost anything else they could do would be more beneficial to society. But I don't think you can get these. There are enough men who have found irresponsibility and the let's say having the weight taken off their shoulders. They've found that freeing. So it's not like you're gonna have to incentivize them taking on responsibility if you expect them to do that. And I don't see us doing that as a culture. No,
we're actively not doing that.
No. Well, worse. We're making the responsible choices, the previously responsible choices, more burdensome and more dangerous, more freighted with consequences.
More expensive.
Yeah. Irresponsibility is cheaper than it's ever been. And men can be like, I love men, and I hope that I've said really positive things about men, but men can also be hyper irresponsible and and have fun with it. And it's a question of, do you want a society where more and more men are doing that? At a certain point, you might wake up and think, oh, damn, we actually needed those men. Drat. And they won't be there to answer the call.
When you stopped playing video games, did you recognize that it was impacting other areas of your life?
Yes. I started reading a lot more. All of the free time that I used to be playing video games was, I never got
You're not speaking to the mic. When you stopped playing video games, did you realize it was impacting other areas of your life?
I did. When I was playing the most video games, my grades were suffering. I was skipping classes more often. Didn't have much of a social life. And when I stopped playing, grades got better, social life improved, and I replaced my leisure hours that were previously spent gaming with time spent reading. And that has been more rewarding to me personally. And now I still play video games, but I actually find it difficult to justify the hours I spend playing video games when I could be reading.
What do you think would be a general incentive for the average man? Well, for the man who's addicted to video games or porn and or both. What do you think would be the driving incentive to reduce their hours online?
They'd have to find something rewarding in the real world that would justify the sacrifice of the fun they have in the virtual world.
But what would, like, in your mind, like if you could pick one
For me,
thing?
it was reading. But for a lot of men, it'll be dating would be a big one. That's
I
one
would
of the
think
things.
dating would be a huge one.
I think that's the one that most commonly causes
Connection.
men. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because among my male friends with girlfriends, one of the perennial tensions is you're spending too much time playing video games. That's not, very few women approve. And maybe I would probably side with the women. Like, I have a lot of friends who, even though they hold down jobs and, a disproportionate amount of their leisure time is spent playing video games. And if you're a woman, I can see why that would be.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, my partner and I play video games from time to time, and he always wants to play more often than I do, and often asks me, like, if we can play another round. And I'll often acquiesce just because, like, it is fun. But it's so funny. Like, it's not how I would want to spend time playing with my partner in something playful. But more than that, and this is why I don't think I ever really got that interested playing computer games in our teen years, is because I always felt this underlying feeling like I was wasting my time, that my time was better spent doing something else in that moment.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure video games are as intrinsically rewarding to the average woman as they are to the average man.
Exactly.
But I think whatever cognitive mechanism makes problem solving in video games rewarding to men also makes it rewarding to men to solve problems in
Some
other fields.
Areas,
Yeah. And there's a minefield.
Yeah, the misuse of potential.
Or to suggest that men, there's something about problem solving in general that attracts men, that they like fixating on a problem.
And why is that a minefield?
Well, if they do it more than women, then there's inequality. It suggests something positive about men that isn't necessarily as positive about women.
Or maybe not necessarily as true for the average woman.
Right. But you're not allowed to say things like this.
We're not allowed to say things like this.
Well, that's actually, when you read that Andrew Yang piece, that's what struck me, is how honest he was about what he perceived as male qualities.
Yeah.
And those are male qualities. It's so funny that we're...
But his title, in the very title, like video games and the male meaning of life.
Mm-hmm.
But
it suggests that there's a different meaning of life for men and women. Oh my God, you can't do that.
No, but
you patriarchal bigot.
But the
How dare you, Andrew Yang, you Democratic nominee for president?
Please run again.
Yeah, please run again.
No, but it's so funny, like how there is like my in talking about all this, it's rather like it can be rather depressing. But like the silver lining for me is in the fact that in the best versions of these games, in the best, scenarios of male camaraderie and teamwork and leadership in these virtual worlds, they're, the meaning they're drawing from them is actually incredibly positive.
Absolutely. And there is a massive aspect of camaraderie there, and
it's escapism into, that's the sad part, into a world that is, where all this positivity can't be tangible. We can't have the positive outcomes. And we want them. Come out and play. Come play in the real world.
I don't know that we want them anymore. I honestly don't.
I do.
Yeah, I know you do. I think, and I think people,
a lot of I think.
But the men certainly don't get the impression that their contribution is valued in the real world.
But you know what's so funny? I feel like if you talk to, it's such a dangerous thing to say, which is dangerous. I hate that we say that. It's such a dangerous thing to say. But like,
true though.
I do feel like the average woman looking for a partner, if any women listen to this podcast at all without abhorring us, is, I think there's like, I don't know. They would want them to come out too and engage with them too. They would want them to feel better. They would want them to be more balanced. They would want them,
I don't disagree,
to become the viable partners, the leaders, the fathers. We do want that in society. We're denying it and pushing it away.
You're saying two separate things though. I think women want men at their best. I do.
I think society wants men at their best.
I mean, everyone at their best benefits society, but the incentives put in place by our post-Christian culture, I don't know that I would agree that they want men at their best at all. Actually, I think they're very content that men are taking this backseat. I think that's how far this ideology has wormed its way into our institutions.
And I guess I'm not convinced in postmodern. In our postmodern culture, whether or not these people are fully aware of the consequences.
No, they're absolutely not aware of the consequences.
And what I think is, if they were fully aware of the consequences, they might change their mind. I'll be bold enough to say that.
I think some of them
will not be convinced. Some of them are happy to continue.
I was going to say they'll burn it all down before they.
But they don't know they're burning it all down.
Some of them do.
You think some of them do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's how.
With knowledge of the consequences.
They
know what they're risking.
They will rather sacrifice a present and existing society in the hopes of achieving their non-existent hypothetical society. They'll make that trade-off every time. Yeah, absolutely.
And do you think they are the majority?
No, but they're very powerful and influential.
And that cannot be disregarded.
No. We should collect, actually, just because if you're listening to this and I sound totally insane, I will collect every article I've read, every op-ed.
I think we have so many.
I probably have a couple hundred saved on my computer or bookmarked, where that's made very explicit. It's like, okay, men, you had your time to like take a backseat.
Well, this is why we're doing what we're doing.
Yes. But I'm just saying, like, there are people who have never heard that. They wouldn't believe that that's a message men are receiving. And men are receiving that message. Not all of them know it's explicit. Not all of them hear it explicitly.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah.
But that message is pretty implicit, and especially if they've gone to university.
And it is the reason why we're doing this podcast.